Well, the early 90s in New York was a really, really brutal time.
It was racist, it was sexist, it was homophobic, and even among white people it was terrible because it was very narrow in the kind of art that you could make.
The Whitney Biennial opened in March 1993, and the Theatre of Refusal opened in April 1993. And there are many parallels, even though one is very well known because of the insane amount of press that it garnered that was negative.
They've been kind of taunting the police.
93 demanded a different time. It was an inflection point in the culture. We were in the midst of a serious recession. Then we had, the Rodney King beating, the AIDS crisis had decimated our community. All of those things with the different composition of the team, we were poised to view things a little bit more expansively and differently. This was the first biennial under a new director, David Ross. He invited Elisabeth to sort of take the lead, and the team was really up to her. So she made the decision about who would participate. It was majority women. For the first time, a curator of color, which had never happened before. And I don't think the critics really talked about that, the composition of the team, but of course it was going to be a different kind of show. So what was the reaction? Howls of negativity, I would say.
David Ross had come to be the director of the Whitney, and we had worked together in Boston at the Institute of Contemporary Art for 12 years. So I came to work for him at the Whitney, and the first assignment I got was the biennial. I already had a notion in my mind what I wanted this biennial to do, and one of the major motivations was that we should look outside of galleries, alternative spaces, unaffiliated people, and so on. So there was much less this kind of sense of going around dutifully visiting all the important galleries and saying, who are your kind of people who should be in this show? It was much more intuitive than that.
The first review, which was done by Roberta Smith, was mixed and appropriately mixed, but the Times didn't let it rest there. They then sent Michael Kimmelman, who was then the chief critic, to review it again. But of course, his review began with that fateful sentence, "I hate this show."
The response to the 93 biennial was intense. And it wasn't something I was personally prepared for. I just had never worked on an exhibition that would have had such a public presence. At the very moment that the exhibition opened, I understood how important it was. It's taken many, many, many years for others to see that, but quite often creating change means that you are working in the present day, but you're actually working in the future.
Most of us came through the door after a major financial crash in the art world. So a lot of installation artists, a lot of video artists, very ephemeral work that didn't involve that kind of financial investment were given opportunities. All I needed was a gallon of chalkboard paint and some chalk and I'm ready to go. So it was economically, it made sense to give these opportunities out because all you had to do at the end of the show was, get out your Benjamin Moore and paint out the show. It made an impression because the idea was to immerse the viewer into this experience and to infuse that kind of politic into the work at that time was the best way to achieve that.
100 people were arrested during a protest. Demonstrators were demanding more money in the war against AIDS. They brought rush hour traffic to a standstill.
I was kind of finding myself as an artist, as a person, and kind of figuring out that I was queer. And then suddenly, it was just this massive, massive tragedy that I couldn't get around. So I started doing activism, getting arrested, going to meetings every week, and kind of got a political education. So I started photographing in medical museums and kind of looking for the roots of what I was seeing play out in my life and my friends' lives. Why, women weren't included in drug trials, why no Black people were included in drug trials, why there wasn't compassionate use. Kind of digging into the visual expression of who we are as a people what we consider worth saving. And somewhere along in there, I decided I wanted to photograph a fashion show. I wanted to think about how women were looked at versus how women look. There was also censorship. I mean, it was a kind of incredibly dense and tragic time, not unlike what we're seeing right now in terms of these moments in history where everything is laid bare. Like there's no cushioning. You just see the brutality of the power systems.
I thought it was really important to create an exhibition that looked at both the Whitney Biennial and the Theatre of Refusal, because if you like, they're two sides of the same coin. The curatorial innovation of Theatre of Refusal was to display works by the artists alongside previously published texts. The aim was to challenge the art world and to propose an alternative. When you start to look at that work 30 years later, there is a resonance and there's a kind of tremoring that these works have in the present moment. So the reason why it's called RETROaction is because I don't think we can explain any more today what that work is about than we could at the time.
We wanted to put these two shows in conversation, but in conversation in an active interventionist way, that both shows rediscovered their aesthetic, political, social agency by bringing them together. It makes you rethink both the now and the then, but what happens when they come together is that it takes you elsewhere. It takes you to a third space. It makes other issues and questions visible. In what way, for instance, do the racial memories of the time in '93 and the ways in which artists tried to articulate them in order to think about Black communities, in order to think about the interaction between different racial gazes, to think about their refusal in those days simply to accept the kind of burden of responsibility for one community or another, but to extend the vision of what it means for oppression in a way to be part of a democratic system.
In many ways, I've been looking at these artists' works ever since. The artists in those exhibitions really form the base that I not only continue in my work to think about legacy and honor artists of the past, but also it informs the way in which I have been able to continually find ways as a curator to think about the work of the present.
If you go back to 1993, there were people at that time saying, where is this democratic dream? You know, much earlier than that, James Baldwin asked a question which reverberates from that time to this time and has not been fully answered. And his question is, do I want to live in a burning house? Should I really want to live in this burning house? Is this, in this burning house, will I be able to, will generations around me able to conceive of what freedom is, or the good life is, or public virtue is? That's the question as pressing now, post George Floyd, as it was then. But the conditions of posing that question have changed.